We are starting now. So this is welcome all to the Tripart Care Emotional Wellbeing Hub for August 2025, sorry. And I'm glad that everyone's been able to make it tonight. And so my name is Dr. T. Ayodele Ajayi for the arts. I'm a public speaker. I sit on a number of boards of charities, and I'm also a public mental health columnist. I write frequently in quite a number of publications regarding mental health, faith, and culture. So and my public mental health work has been featured in the BBC and quite a number of other media outlets. So as we go through the course of the evening, I'll be sharing large volumes of information. Some of them will be new, some of them will be things that you are just getting to know about. But the whole essence is to really reflect throughout the course of the evening as you are taking your notes. I'm going to challenge you to begin to reflect on how am I going to use this new knowledge. For some of them, it's going to be new. Some of them is going to be knowledge that you've had before and is being revisited. Some of them is new insight on old knowledge. But whatever it is, how are you going to apply that? And why should you apply it? Why should you apply that new knowledge? And when will you begin to apply that new knowledge? And the other thing is, who can help you to apply and implement what you are learning today? And then who can hinder you or what can hinder you? Because many times when we get new knowledge, we are so enthusiastic about it. We are really excited, like we should be. We plan all the successes. We plan that it's going to be a smooth journey, but we don't plan that there might be ups and downs, and that part of the planning to make sure that this works for us is to plan the ups and the downs, to also be aware of what can help me and what can hinder me. Because when we are aware of those, then we can do something about it. And the most important part of all this pill is this. The most important part is, what is the next simple step I'm going to take this evening? What's the next simple step? Because the reality is that that first step is almost always the most important one. And that's also science. It's also science that the major hurdle is taking that first step. It's overcoming that inertia. It's overcoming because physics tells us that everybody remains in a state of rest until there is a counteracting force that is able to overcome that state of inertia. So what we really need to be doing today is to take that first step and to take it as quickly as possible. It doesn't have to be anything major. For instance, it might be just doing an inventory and looking at, actually, I didn't realize that the way I'd been showing up before in my relationships, the way that I lack ability to trust people has something to do with childhood trauma. Sometimes we don't make the link. So sometimes it's just about, okay, I'm going to become more aware of that sort of thing. So one of the first things I learned as a medical educator or in medical education was this. They say a good teacher or a good speaker or a good presenter tells you what they're about to tell you. They go ahead to tell you what they want to tell you. And when they've told you what they want to tell you, they then round up by telling you what they've just told you. So basically, they tell you, be prepared, this is what we are going to do. They then go ahead and share the information. And after sharing the information, they go ahead and do a summary. I'm sure that I'm going to be able to tell you what I'm about to tell you. I'm going to be able to deliver the information. I'm hoping that maybe during the question and answer, we can sort of question and answer session, we can recap on what I've already told you or what we've already shared. So the main things we are going to talk about today is, what is trauma? It's not physical trauma we are talking about emotional trauma here. And what happens in the brain and in the chemical systems of the body when trauma happens. Because sometimes you hear people say, oh, why don't you get over it? Oh, it's not a big deal. The reality is that a lot of people cannot get over trauma because there has been changes in their brains. And sometimes we look at them and we are thinking they are being lazy, they are being unmotivated, they are not being strong, they are not being resilient. But it's more than that, because when trauma happens, the brain changes. And it's important to bear that in mind. When we bear that in mind, then it helps us to be able to relate to people. One of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is really in terms of how do you support people in your life who have experienced trauma? How do you help them to recover, to come to healing? So we're then going to look at adverse childhood experiences. In this room today, I can see many parents, I can see many grandparents, and I can see teachers, I can see mentors, I can see coaches. And the information about trauma is very important to this group of people because you are influencers, because you are people who can either shape or break other people's lives, particularly children. One way or the other, each one of us on this group have contact in one way or the other to children, some of us more directly than others. And we know that adverse childhood experiences can be, it's like programming the future mental health of a child when that child experiences either adverse childhood experiences. But there's also a flip side of that coin that very often we don't talk about. A lot of people talk about, and it's good, we need to talk about adverse childhood experiences because we need to avoid them as much as we can. But the flip side of that coin is that there's also positive childhood experiences, and that in fact, positive childhood experiences can counteract or balance in some way the negative effect of adverse childhood experiences. So we're going to look at all of that. And post-traumatic stress disorder, everybody hears PTSD, but some of us might have begun to hear now that past PTSD, we are now talking about CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. What's the difference between the two? We're going to look at that as well. Because sometimes the people that we find difficult to get along with in our jobs, in our families, in our workplaces, in our churches, in our communities, it may actually be that what we are dealing with is trauma responses that they are bringing into the relationship. And because we think they're just being difficult or they're just being obnoxious, we don't really support them the way they should be supported. So it's really important that we bear that in mind, that sometimes trauma is what people are bringing into the relationship. And because we misconstrue that for other things, we might not really be able to support them in the way they should be supported. So post-traumatic, and then we're also going to talk about post-traumatic growth. Everybody talks about post-traumatic stress, but there's also post-traumatic growth, which is a lot of people don't talk about that as well. That with every opportunity, when people get exposed to trauma, there's also an opportunity for growth to take place from that. And that's good news. That whilst the brain is adapting to the trauma, the brain is also looking for methods for the person to live a different life where they're able to function and where they're able to make meaning out of the trauma and actually grow from it. So it's not all doom and gloom when it's the business of trauma. In fact, there are many positive things that can come out of that. So, and then we are going to round up looking at how do you recognize. We are going to be looking at the different features, but also what do you do for recovery, and then we are going to share a few tools, tips, and thoughts, and then do a Q&A. So let's start with this very gripping quote. This lady who is written this is entitled to write it because she is a living testimony. She's survived childhood trauma herself. She had multiple forms of childhood trauma to the point in which she was at some point in her life, she was contemplating to opt out and take her own life. However, she then began a journey that led her to recovery, a journey that led her to actually training as a counselor. And in the United States, she now works as a Christian counselor and brings hope and healing to people who have had a similar experience as herself. But the only difference is that she's coming from a place of lived experience because she can say, I've been there. I know what it feels like. So she says, we live in the stories that we tell ourselves, and the stories that we tell ourselves are based on the experiences that we have had. That's the reality. That's why you sometimes see people who, maybe because of trauma that has been experienced, they can see the most negative predictions in the most positive situation. because there's something that's happened in the past that has changed the way they see the world. And that's the story. A story has changed their story, and that's the new story that they then begin to carry. Um, there's also another quote here. I'm just using this quote to try and shape our thinking as we go into today. This is the one of the fathers of trauma work, one of the grandfathers of trauma therapy and trauma work, really. One of the most globally known names of trauma. It says the parent-child connection is the most the most powerful mental health intervention known to mankind. In lay language, what Dr. or Professor Bessel van der Kolk is saying is that the interaction between the parent and the child could actually make a world of difference, not only in their current mental health, but importantly, in their future mental health. But more than that, in the mental health and mental well-being of the generations to come. One of the slides, I'm just going to go ahead of myself and share that. One of the slides I'm going to share today actually shows us that the effect of trauma can be replicated up until the 14th generation, not the 4th, the 14th generation. I think that's something that I'm going to allow us to sit with for a moment and see why it's important for us to recognize trauma in our communities. It's important for people who have experienced traumas to be healed, to recover, because when that doesn't happen, it's like paying a debt to the next generation. It's like they are carrying a debt and passing it on to the next generation. Then that next generation passes on to the next generation, because the reality is that by default, whether we know it or we are aware of it or we are not aware of it, we parent like we were parented. We need to be intentional in order to change the way we are going to parent our own children. We need to be intentional, because by default, we are programmed to do exactly the way our parents did. And so we can see how trauma can become something that is passed from one generation to the other. So this one says, trauma is not what happened to you, but what happened inside you as a result of what happened to you. That's another grandfather, Gabon mates. He's based in Canada. Bessel van der Kolk is based in Boston. So these two men are really saying the way it is, that trauma is not about what's happened. It's about what happens. I said earlier that actually our brain changes when it encounters trauma. There are brain changes, and I'm going to go into the nitty-gritty of that very shortly. Also, coming back to Kobe Campbell, and one of the books that were recommended at the end of the meeting is actually written by Kobe Campbell. She's like I said, she's a certified licensed Christian counselor in the United States. And she's written a book about her own experience and about recovery. It's oh God, why am I like this? Something like that. And so she says trauma is an emotional wound of the past that affects how we live our lives in the present, but also how we view the future. So something happens in the past, there are brain changes. It affects the way we now see the present, how we show up every day, but also it's also laying claim to the future, how we see the future, how we are going to how our relationships are going to pan out in the future, and how we are going to live that future. So it's huge. It's really huge. That trauma is a huge thing that we need to really be paying attention to. Right. So I think this is the final quote before we then go into. So that's another Bessel van der Kolk quote. It says, trauma is something terrible that happens to a person that upsets them so much that it overwhelms them. So that's why we say that not every one of us at some point experiences trauma, but not everyone is traumatized. Because traumatized means that those changes have taken place, that person now sees the world in a different way. They see themselves in a different way. They see the future in a different way. Importantly, that those changes have taken place not only in the brain, but also in the body. So it says trauma is something that happened to a person that upsets them so much that it overwhelms them. There's nothing that the victim can do to stave off that inevitable, and that begins to generate a number of emotions for them. Those emotions we are going to very quickly come to. Okay, and that's another very leading author in the trauma space, Mariel who has said that trauma is an event or series of events. The point about that again is that she says that it's such that it leaves an imprint in the soul. That's what, and that it makes one more tender and more sensitive. Have you come across colleagues, people in your churches, people in your communities, bosses, even maybe sometimes members of the family, whom you just tread on eggshells around them, because you've got to be careful what you say or what you don't say, because they almost always take things so personal, and they almost always take things wrong. They almost always personalize things. I'm not saying that it's a rule, but many times than not, it may be that there's some unresolved trauma. It may be that that sensitivity, that inability to be able to regulate emotions might actually have a lot to do with a past trauma that they might not even be aware of, or they might not have addressed in the past. So I'm hoping that as I'm saying some of these things, that you are getting some insight, and that you are beginning to think about it yourself, and think about other people in your lives. So at this point, I'm just going to show a quick video. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to show a quick video. Let's hear from the horse's mouth himself. Let's hear from Basil van der Kolk on what his take is on trauma. So I'm hoping that maybe during the Q&A we can share the video. So now let's think about trauma. Trauma really, in terms of what exactly we've been talking about trauma. To start with, we are not talking about physical trauma here. It's not about breaking a bone or cutting a finger or anything like that. It's emotional trauma. But the interesting thing is that even though it's invisible, nobody sees it with their eyes, is equally as impactful, if not more impactful. And that's also something that sometimes deters people from getting help, or deters other people from being able to render support, because they can't see it. If somebody breaks a bone, then we can see it. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that there's no wound in the heart. There's no wound in the soul. And that wound can continue to fester like any physical wound, and continue to wreak the type of damage that physical wounds wreak when they are not treated. They become infected, they can become gangrenous, and all sorts of things can go wrong. There can be generalized infection where the blood gets poisoned. And in the same way, the mind will get to that point. So trauma really, here we are talking about any moment or series of moments that occur is such that they have a lasting negative effect on the person's mind or the person's body. It might be physical, it might be they have negative spiritual effects, financial, social. It's almost like a global negative effect on that individual. And it's usually something that's happened in the past. It shapes the way we see the future, it shapes the way we act in the present, and it shatters the future. And it can negatively, like I said, really impact ourselves, how we perceive others, and how we anticipate the future. Trauma, like I said earlier, it could be one-off events. It could just be one-off event. It could be prolonged events. Sometimes it's not a massive event. Sometimes it's somebody living with somebody, maybe an insubordinate, a boss that doesn't believe in them. Sometimes it's just snide comments here and there, but it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. So sometimes, because people think about, oh, it's a major trauma, maybe there's a disaster, somebody was involved in a motor accident, or somebody maybe had a physical assault, or maybe a sexual assault, or maybe they were involved in domestic violence. Sometimes it's not that. Sometimes it's somebody who just constantly wears them out, just creeping, making comments. Sometimes it's also racial. It's just subtle. It's just there in the background, chipping at that person's confidence, chipping at the way they see themselves. And the other thing is that the effect of trauma can be masked sometimes. Sometimes there are people who are high performers, so they are acing it all over the place. But sometimes it's actually the trauma that is making them ace it. And I'll tell you why. So there's no one who will be able to know this person, and the reality is that the story has been anonymized anyway. Now, a while back, years ago, actually, I came across a person who was a leading name in their industry. They were in one of the most lucrative industries in society. Not only so, they also were in one of the most lucrative sectors that of that um, of that area of work, of that industry. But importantly, they were also very blessed. They were doing really, really, really well. They were on top of their game. They were in the boardrooms, and everybody looked up to them. But the interesting thing was this: that at some point in their lives, everything just started to crumble. um, the relationship went, the job went, they went from the top of the ladder of their career right to start at the bottom again. The marriage broke up. They had to put the £1 million property, about £1 million property on the market because everybody was going their separate ways. Everything was just in tatters. But importantly, they were now at a point where they were wanting to take their lives. And when they came into my clinic, I wanted to know. I was curious. What's happened? Why is this happening? Let's try and unpack this. It turns out that this person who is now between their 50s and 60s, they are dancing around, they're already almost done with their 50s, going towards their 60s, tells me that when they were less than 10 years old, maybe about 7 years old or so, that they lost a sibling, a sister died, and they held themselves responsible for not saving the life of the sister. Now, this is a 7-year-old holding themselves responsible for not saving the life of a 9-year-old. But this was what was important. The reason why they felt like that about themselves was that their parents were overbearing, and they had this type of parents who never approved of them, who never celebrated them, who never loved them and validated them for who they were. And there was nothing that they did that was good enough. And so the reason why they kept climbing and climbing and climbing was because they were looking for the time when their parents were going to be able to say, yes, you've done well. But then things began to change because the parents began to get old. Now we are looking at a man who is dancing around his 60s. So the parents are dancing around their 80s and 90s. And then I think one of them became unwell and had dementia, which became apparent that actually what the person was looking for, they were never going to get it. And that's when the chickens began to come home to roost. And gradually, all that drive to achieve and to accomplish, to really be on top of the ladder, to be able to get a well done and validation from the parents, all of that began to crumble like a pack of cards. And before you know it, everything was in tatters. The interesting thing is they had never spoken to anyone about this. In fact, until they came to that clinic, they had never made join the dots like that. So the point I'm trying to make is that the fact that somebody is high functioning and looking like they're on top of their game does not mean that they have not experienced trauma. They will know, and the people who are nearest and dearest to them will know. They might not know what it is, but they will know that there's something that doesn't quite add up. As I said earlier, two people can experience the same traumatic event. One of them gets trauma, the other doesn't. In terms of, there are so many things that determine whether somebody is traumatized or not. It's about neurobiology in terms of the way they are naturally wired. It's about the previous experiences of trauma that they've had. It's about the support in their lives. We know without a shadow of doubt that when somebody goes through a very difficult life situation, whatever it is, physical, emotional, whatever sort of hassle, whatever sort of challenge they have in their lives, if they are well supported, their outcomes are usually a lot better than somebody who doesn't have support. And that's one of the reasons why this is important to our communities. It matters when we visit people, when we stand by them, when we give them phone calls, when we send them text messages. As a rule, when when my friends, obviously it's an for most things, I mean, it's the reality of life. That's as one gets into middle age and you get into your golden years, parents begin to also leave us. So these days, when my friends lose their parents, or I make it a point of duty to be there, to be physically and emotionally present in an intentional way, because I know that that's huge trauma. And sometimes people don't realize that, and particularly for men. Um, so it's so but the point I'm trying to make here is that social support can actually make a difference. And in fact, we now know that even when children experience adverse childhood experiences, which we are coming to very shortly, that if there is a stabilizing adult in their lives, a safe space, somebody who is able to contain them, somebody where they feel a space where somebody or something that makes them feel safe, particularly somebody, then their outcomes are a lot better than a child that doesn't have such relationships in their lives. So it doesn't have to. Sometimes a child can be going through parental divorce. They can be going through, their parents might not value them. Their parents might be harsh on them. Their parents might be quite critical of them. Their parents might be shouting and screaming at them, which I don't approve, by the way. I'm not saying it's okay. I'm saying it's not okay. But sometimes there could be a compensating adult. It could be a teacher who believes in them. It could be a grandparent. It could be an uncle. It could be an auntie. It could be somebody else who creates that safety for them and where they can thrive and blossom. And we know that even despite those challenges, of course, it's not that they will go unscattered, but they do a lot better than somebody who doesn't have that privilege. So types of trauma, it could be acute, through road traffic accidents, sexual assault, sudden losses, physical assaults, but it could also be chronic, like bullying, like domestic violence, like racism, like neglect, like emotional neglect, like we talked about the person I was talking about earlier. And then complex, it could be complex in terms of it's repeated and it's multiple. And sometimes it could be vicarious in terms of its secondary. People who work in the caring professions, coaches, mentors, pastors, teachers, um, uh, doctors, people who work in emergency services, firefighters, policemen, all of us who are always in the forefront, emergency workers, the reality is that because we get exposed to trauma all of the time, and it's almost like the bread and butter of our work, we need to be aware of that and to be able to manage the situation, because there's what is called secondary trauma, where you are not the one that is directly experiencing the trauma, but you are hearing of it over and over again, and it can equally impact you like it impacted the person who has the primary trauma. That's shocking, but it's true. I know it's shocking, but it is true. And that's why it's important for us to have safe spaces. That's why I feel that it's important for leaders as well, not to be people whom the buck stops with you. Who do you give the buck to? Because sometimes people who are in leadership have no safe spaces to go to. It's just everything stops with you, and you keep taking on and taking on and taking on and taking on. And that comes with the various forms of consequences. So now, let's look at, I can see quite a number of things in the charts, but I'll come to that shortly. So what does trauma do to the brain? I said that trauma changes the brain. There are three major things, apart from all the other things that happen. One is that trauma affects or it alters the threat or alarm system of the brain. There's what is called the amygdala, which is the fire alarm center of the brain, is the threat center of the brain. What happens during trauma, if somebody's been traumatized, is that area becomes hypersensitive. The way to think about it is, think about the amygdala as your fire alarm in your kitchen. If you are having a barbecue in your kitchen, which you shouldn't be doing, or if you left, for instance, you didn't put on the timer, you forgot your sauce on the cooker or something, and it's burnt and it begins to smoke, your fire alarm is entitled to go off. And thank God that it goes off, because then it means that it alerts you. But if you are boiling your kettle to make a cup of tea in the morning, and every time you boil your kettle, when the kettle boils and there's vapor, If your fire alarm is going off, then that's trouble, because it means that your fire alarm is hypersensitive. That's exactly the way to describe what happens in the amygdala when somebody's been traumatized. It picks up every single thing as aggravation and threat, and it then sets off the alarm, which means that all the chemicals that are meant to be released when there's a real alarm gets released. So the cortisol, the adrenaline, and so it's almost like the body is almost always on hyper alert. That's good for a short period, but if the body is always on hyper alert, it's like you are wearing out the body. That's exactly what those hormones are doing, because they are meant to be elevated for a short period to help you to rise up to the challenge, and then they go back to baseline. When that doesn't happen, then all the organs of the body begin to suffer. Um, so and so that's one, that's the amygdala, that's the fire alarm center, or the threat center. There's also the prefrontal cortex, the frontal part of the brain. What the prefrontal cortex does is that it's the center that determines emotional regulation, is the one that helps us when somebody at work says something that aggravates us, is the one that holds us back from pulling a punch at them because we know that's not the appropriate thing to do, is the one that helps us to be able to hold back ourselves in a meeting. That's what the frontal part of the brain does, but it's also the one responsible for concentration, for attention, but also for rational thinking and for decision making and planning. When somebody is traumatized, what happens is that that area of the brain could go offline, and it means that the threat center then begins to run the show. I'm sure that we can begin to picture what's happening here. If the threat center runs the show and the rational center is on the back seat, you can now understand why everything appears to be personal, why everything appears to be a threat, and why sometimes we have people who overreact to things. In your own diary, in your own dictionary, it looks like this is overreaction, but for them, there's a threat. And the third part of the brain that is also affected is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the area of the brain that is responsible for memory, is our memory store, is the one that's responsible for making memories, but also storing memories. And imagine a filing cabinet. You know, years ago, years ago, many years ago, when I was introduced to Microsoft and all of that, I just used to save my files anywhere. So sometimes I'm looking for files and it can take me 10, 15 minutes looking for a file because it was just saved anywhere. But then I began to realize that actually you don't need to save your files anywhere. You could have folders, and that you could so if you put your document in a folder, all you need to do is to go to the folder where it's filed, and then you can find it. Not that you would then have 2001 documents all over the place, just dancing all over the place. And that's exactly what happens with traumatic memory when somebody has experienced trauma and has been traumatized. It's like you are just chucking all the memory into your filing cabinet and you keep pushing them in. And what then happens is that someday when you open the filing cabinet, what happens? Everything just comes at you because it's not been filed away. So that's why people have flashbacks and nightmares, because those memories are just jottling back into consciousness at a time when you don't want them. If you filed your cabinet, if you've put your things properly in the cabinets they should be, when you open the cabinet, you go straight to what you want and you bring it out. When you put them in a haphazard way, whatever just finds itself first comes out. And that's a very graphical way to describe what's happening with the fragmented memories of post-traumatic stress disorder and when people have been traumatized. So the other thing is that I talked about rising hormones, that the stress hormones rise to rise to the occasion when the fire alarm goes out. And usually they should go back to baseline. But in a traumatized person, they remain high. And all the other things that are associated with that begins to happen. So and when those hormones are high, when those stress hormones are high, there are several responses you get. Five Fs. There's the fights, which we all know about. Sometimes you have people who are perpetually aggressive. They have a controlling behavior. They almost like bullies or demanding and harsh. Sometimes we see them as the villain, but actually maybe they are the victims. maybe something's actually happened that they are not even aware of that has made them. It's almost like I will get you before you get me. And that's the fight response. But there's also the flight. Somebody is almost always fleeing. People who are anxious, people who are workaholics, people who have a messiah syndrome. It's almost like this is the only way I make sure that things are going to work right because I don't want anyone to let me down again. It also includes perfectionism, anxiety. It also includes being paranoid. And then there's the freeze when the person is just not able to do anything. That includes just zoning out, dissociating. You can see that sometimes people tell you that, oh yeah, I don't remember what happened yesterday. Yesterday just feels like a days to me. Or the fun. The fun are people who just, it's almost like they neutralize, they become, it's almost like the threat or the trauma didn't exist. It's almost like blending in all with the trauma. And that's what happens in people who in Stockholm syndrome, where people begin to defend or even actually sort of form a strong relationship, sometimes a romantic relationship with the aggressor. And of course, the other one is firm. Um, when somebody has had trauma, because they are trying to make sure that it doesn't happen again, they become hyperassertive. They become they become hyperassertive, and they might actually be able to put boundaries in place that could actually help them in terms of going forward, and that can come out for strong relationship. So this is really something I've come up with: the 10 Ds that are associated with trauma responses. Denial. Denial is a very common one. That didn't happen to me just not too long ago, or just some time ago. I came across somebody who had clearly had prolonged period of childhood trauma. For sake of confidentiality, I wouldn't say exactly what. The prolonged period of childhood trauma, it was very clear. And the interesting thing is they went on to really excel, to do really well, really, really well. And they just said that didn't happen until, unfortunately, the aggressor got into trouble. And the aggressor, in trying to protect themselves, then called the aggressed and said, oh, can you imagine what people are saying? They are trying to put mud over me. And then they it suddenly the chickens suddenly begin to come home to roost, that actually they are not putting mud over you. You did that to me as well. And then one thing led to the other, and then got proven that in the actual sense that actually happened. Denial is a very common thing. Distraction. Sometimes we distract ourselves with work. Sometimes we distract ourselves with other things. Really, sometimes overwork is actually running away from the memory of the trauma. Disconnection and distancing. People who can just engage in relationships, they are there, but there's no presence. They are present, but not present. They are present, but there's no presence. Drink and drugs sometimes is to try and nurture the pain of the trauma. Destructive behavior, road rage, gambling, sexual addiction, self-harm. Uh, we are very quick in our communities to stigmatize people who self-harm. We think they are just looking for attention. But sometimes many people that I see who self-harm, when I ask them, what's the reason? What does self-harm do for you? They tell me this. They say, I'm not trying to take my life. I'm only trying to feel something. I just want to feel something. When I cut myself and I feel the pain and I see the blood and the red, it reminds me that I'm alive, because otherwise I'm just dissociated. I just don't feel anything. Destructive behavior, that includes staying in a violent relationship, sometimes self-sabotaging, having affairs when everything is just going right. I've talked about dissociation, and of course, sometimes depression, sometimes self-disgust, people who can't stand themselves. Um, all of these things are things that happen. And of course, the other one is sadly suicide and physical health problems as well. So what are the common emotional, those are the things that people do in terms of coping with trauma. But how does it pan out in their relationships and their behaviors? Fear of abandonment. Sometimes people say, oh, my spouse is clingy, or my brother is clingy, or my boss is clingy. It might not be, it might be more than that. There might be something that's happened. Sense of entitlement. subjugating personal needs for the needs of others, being aloof, being emotionally distant, being excessively cautious about life, a sense of inferiority or superiority. It could be either of them. Or it could be a deep sense of self-loathing and self-criticism. And these are the other things that trauma does to people. Trauma is exhausting emotionally. I want to say that again, that trauma is emotionally draining and exhausting. And these are the gamut of things that can happen. Sometimes it's about trying to keep up. Sometimes it's about trying to hide the feelings. Sometimes it's about not wanting people to know. Sometimes it's about the trauma of reliving the experience. Can you imagine somebody who works in a place where, for one reason or the other, they are constantly triggered and re-traumatized by the nature of their jobs, and these things happen. Where going to work is like, oh, I hope nobody's going to come in today that's going to remind me of that trauma and make me have a flashback. Trauma is commoner. This is what this slide is saying. It's a lot commoner than we think. And the other sad thing is that they say that it takes, on the average, about 7 years for somebody, a child who has experienced sexual assault or childhood sexual assault, to confide in anyone. 7 full years. I think that's an indictment against community in terms of really where are the safe spaces. Um, and these figures just show that it's common. Trauma is a lot commoner, and so knowing that will help us to be able to sort of give people space and room, and to sort of look beyond their behavior and see what might be driving it. So, how does trauma manifest itself in loving relationships, in parenting, in marriages, in interactions with spouses, in interactions with friendships? The first one is difficulty trusting. People who have experienced trauma traditionally may find it difficult to trust, may find it difficult to relax, may find it difficult to give or particularly to receive love. They might always be on the edge. Always the trauma, the fight, flight, fawn response is almost always on freeze. And of course, for somebody who has experienced sexual trauma, it might have been way back in childhood. Sometimes that then goes into their intimate relationships as adults, causing huge problems in the intimate relationships in terms of the physical part of their relationships. And if somebody is married to such a person, it's important for that person to be very understanding, but also to support them in seeking help, not to push them, but to support them, because it's got to be at a time when they are ready. And the important thing here is support, and that is commoner than we realize. Sometimes intense self-loathing, people particularly who just can't stand certain areas of their body, particularly maybe the areas of their body that are not visible, the areas of their body that are meant to be private. Sometimes it can actually be that it's a sign that they've had sexual trauma in the past. Um, and so mood swings, we've talked about dissociation, controlling behavior. They are not controlling because they want to control the world. They are controlling because that's the only way they can guarantee that they are not going to have those difficult experiences again. So the physical aspects of trauma, um, it could the Basil van der Kolk book says the body keeps the score, and that's the book that we're going through in the book club at the moment. The body keeps the score. It's about the fact that it's not just the brain that changes. The body also experiences. It's almost like the body keeps a memory of that trauma, of that overwhelming situation, such that um, chronic physical pain, digestive problems, immune system compromises, all of those things can happen as a result of trauma. And in fact, they now say that people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences could have up to less than 20 years compromise in their life expectancy. 20 years, not 2. That's huge. And sometimes as well, I feel that trauma could also play up, unaddressed trauma could play up in almost in self-sabotage. It could play up it could play up in a spiritual way, in terms of people just going off and doing things that are really out of ordinary or out of character, um, going off into having affairs and all those sort of things, because the issues that were the fundamental issues have not been dealt with. And of course, the other thing is that relationships are affected. It's not just So those are all the consequences. So what are adverse childhood experiences? Simply, they are highly stressful situations that happen in childhood, and they are similar to their traumatic experiences, but they are such that it overwhelms that child. It overwhelms their ability to be able to cope, and they happen both in childhood and in adolescence. And they can be a single event like the trauma we've talked about. They are basically traumatic experiences. It could be parental divorce, parental marital disharmony. It could be physical abuse. It could be even living with an adult or another child who has a mental illness. It could be favoritism. It could be sibling rivalry. It could be a parent showing favoritism towards one child. All sorts of things. Anything. It could be bullying at school. It could be grooming. All sorts of things that really affect the way that child feels about themselves and compromises their safety. Um, and also, one that we don't commonly think about is having a sibling who has a special need. Because when there's a sibling with a special need, the parents need to be intentional to make sure that they are balanced in the way, they are proportionate in the way they offer attention. Because it's very easy to concentrate on the child with the need and not be aware that in an inadvertent way, the other children are being neglected. So that's really important. Um, there's also parental abandonment, or even children, sadly, who lose their parents very earlier on. If there's a member of the family, maybe an adult who uses drugs or who uses drinks, who has a mental illness, undermining children, dismissive parenting, overdriven parenting, that's one that is common in our Black communities. I didn't quite make it to study engineering. It was always my wish. Somehow I ended up in medical school, but you know what? One of my children must end up as an engineer. And so when Johnny is really inclined to read law, we want him to be an engineer. And we are really programming and almost and getting offended when they are not. It's very subtle, but children can pick up on that. Yelling at children, critical parenting, comparing them, and of course, the huge, huge one that we are currently dealing with. And I hope that everyone in this community who lives in places where people are moving from their country of origin and currently moving into other countries. It's happening in the United States, it's happening in Canada, it's happening in Australia, it's happening over here in the UK. Please let's be on the lookout. Immigration problems, immigration challenges can be a huge, huge source of adverse childhood experiences for children. They come in from a place where they know into a strange country, strange food, they lose all their friends, they move into a new area, and many times, more likely than not, they actually slide down the social ladder. So it's all new experience for them. And then they get to school, people are bullying them for their accent because they don't speak. It's just a lot. So if we have people like that in our communities, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, please let's support them, because we just may not know how much impact that support could mean. Um, so what are the consequences of adverse childhood experiences? We've talked about mental difficulties, anxiety, depression. Basically, every child we are dealing with, particularly as parents or the main caregiver, we are literally writing the script for their future mental health. That's what we are doing. And if we know that it helps us to treat them in a different way, post-traumatic stress disorder, learning problems at school, we've talked about, even now, we now know that things like obesity, heart disease, um, um, other chronic physical health illnesses, arthritis, even chronic pain, are now being associated with trauma, emotional trauma, heart disease, diabetes, are now being associated, and that when people have had experiences of adverse childhood experiences, that they are at higher risk of having marital difficulties, poor employment, poor social status, interpersonal problems, being victims of violence and perpetrator of violence. But importantly, the generational impacts. Generational impact. I said earlier, for those who are just joining us, that research does show that 14 generations, some people can still continue to pass on the trauma. 14 generations, 1-4. That's huge. It's really huge. It's really huge. I think there is another study that says that in currently that in each of us, that particularly when somebody has experienced trauma, 264 um, representations from phobias whom we are carrying. So it's so we talk about adverse childhood experiences, the various things that cause that. But the other thing is that there's past positive childhood experiences. Everybody goes on about ACEs, 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 but there's also PCEs. PCEs are positive childhood experiences that, as a grandparent, as a teacher, as a mentor, as a Sunday school teacher, or as a mentor, as a coach, that the presence of somebody who is grounding in the life of a child can actually compensate for negative childhood experiences that they might be experiencing, and that's good news. It means that trauma is not winning. That actually, yeah, a child might experience trauma, might be experiencing trauma, but it's the support that we are putting in place. That's why I usually say that it's important for people to engage with support from social services earlier on. In our communities as well, we frown at social service. We think they are coming to take my children away. Actually, they are coming to put in support, and that support can actually save the life of that child now, but also save their mental health for the future and the generation of their own children. So it's huge. It's more than just. It's not about coming to say take children away. It's about really coming to give support, and it's important that we realize these things. A supportive adult, belonging, a sense of belonging. Maybe they belong to a karate group, or they belong to a singing group, or they belong to a musical group. That sense of feeling like they plug into something bigger than them is always very helpful. An opportunity for play and for learning. All of those are positive childhood experiences, and they can compensate. So quickly, PTSD, everybody knows. We've talked about all the different types of trauma, and we've said that it's not just being directly involved. Sometimes it's also about witnessing it. Sometimes it's learning about it. Sometimes it's single experience. Sometimes, but it's usually life-threatening. So what is PTSD? One, you can't talk about PTSD except a traumatic event has occurred. Post-traumatic stress, it's trauma. Trauma has occurred. But also, there are certain core features. One of them is reliving the experience. That could be in form of daylight, where it almost looks like they are awake in broad daylight, and it looks like it's a movie going on, and they are seeing they are seeing that scene replayed again, the scene of the trauma. Maybe they are seeing the car coming at them, or they are seeing they are seeing maybe something, maybe somebody fall off a roof, or it's almost like there's a visual replay. Sometimes it comes in nightmares. Sometimes it comes in visual memories. It's not really vivid, but it's like their minds replaying it. And that's one, reliving the experience. There's a trauma, there's a reliving of the experience, but there's also a alertness. The person is almost always keyed up. When something drops, they jump. And it's like, oh, it's almost like when they hear news, it's almost like they're on high alert all the time. They are keyed up all the time. That's hyper alertness. It's also a hyper arousal, in the sense that it takes very little to get them from 0 to 1,000 in terms of emotions. All of those things, and it also includes being irritable, having problems sleeping. All of those things go under the category of hyper alertness and hyper arousal. And then the other thing is that they would avoid the reminders, because the reason why they're avoiding reminders is because anytime they get exposed, that's why recently I was speaking to somebody and they say, oh, they work in healthcare. They used to enjoy medical dramas, but sadly, they had a very difficult hospital admission, ended up in intensive care. And now they can't even stand switching on the television, anything to do with medical drama, because as soon as they hear a blip or they hear anything that's relating to anything hospital, it just brings back all the memories again. So they then deliberately avoid. And of course, there's emotional blunting, in terms of sometimes people are just, it's like they are there, not there. Sometimes time just goes, passes, and they are not aware of it. They are dissociated. It's called dissociation. And of course, there are other features that these are not, depression is not it's not an hallmark. It's not, you don't have to, depression does not have to be present to diagnose PTSD, but most times they are present. Anxiety may be present, addictions, or other harmful coping skills. Complex PTSD, it has all the features of PTSD, but this is the thing. it's usually trauma that is repeated over a long period of time. So it's constant, prolonged trauma. And most times usually happened in childhood. So apart from all the features that I've talked about, they also have difficulty regulating moods, but also importantly, they have difficulty with interpersonal relationships. They can't relax and trust people. Even if they have a long-term relationship, you can see that that person is not, they don't connect. And importantly, there's also a personalization of the trauma, such that the person, no matter how things are going well, they see themselves as damaged, defeated, or just they just feel that there's nothing in life for them. They feel diminished. They feel that that trauma has sort of changed them entirely. And that also happens. And of course, the consequence is that it affects the way they function in life, in love, in leadership, in every area of life. So the only difference between complex PTSD and PTSD is that there's all the features of PTSD, but there's also difficulty with relationships, difficulty trusting, difficulty in relationship, but also there's a personalization of the trauma. In terms of interpersonal difficulties, they have a stable sense of self that they are no good and that nothing is really good for them. So so what can people do? Beginning to round up now. What can people do? Recognition, because like I said, denial is a very common thing. Avoidance, intellectualization. You just sort of reason it away. You rationalize it, but in actual sense, it's there. The first thing is to recognize and to actually acknowledge that this has happened, and this needs to be addressed, and to ask the difficult questions. This has happened to me, and I need help. And of course, to request help. Usually, I say the GP will be the first place to start from. And one of the things we do at Tripod Care is that we really support people in trying to signpost them to where they can get help. But the GP is usually the first place to start. And then the recovery is a journey, not an event. It's a long haul. It's rethinking. Post-traumatic growth takes time because basically what the brain is doing is that all those areas that have been wired in a different way, they have to rewire. And like I said, it's not just it's not a 3-week job. Sometimes it takes months and months, but the good thing is that it's happening. And the thing to do is to try and tell the story. Most people who have had trauma have never told the story because they've never felt safe to tell the story. Telling the story can be one of the major steps to recovery. Telling the story in a safe place, and I've qualified that because telling the story in an unsafe place can actually lead to re-traumatization. So it's important to tell it in a safe place. The story has an history. It has changed somebody's identity, and actually it has changed their destiny as well until that story is rewritten. So, and of course, at the end of that recovery, then there's a relearning and a renewal, a revival. It's a different person that emerges, and that's when we start talking about post-traumatic growth. In terms of what does the Royal College of Psychiatry say in terms of intervening for, the good thing about trauma is this, that there are PTSD is one of the conditions I really like to treat. The reason being that people get well, people get better. There is lots of evidence-based interventions. There's trauma-focused CBT. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, where that person is exposed to that trauma again, but in a very guided way, and they are taught to think in a different way and to see the trauma in a different way, and people get results. EMDR. For instance, I'm an EMDR practitioner in terms of I'm able to help people with that, administer EMDR. And basically, it's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. I know it's a very mouthful word, mouthful of term, but what it means is that we guide the person to recall the trauma, and we start moving our fingers or bilateral movements. It could be making them move their eyes making them follow your fingers as they move their eyes, or it could even be tapping themselves, just tapping like that, or it could be bilaterally listening to sound. But it's bilateral stimulation, either of the eyes or one part of the sense. There are off senses. The one that is commonly used is the eyes. And what happens is that You know that um, cluttered, disorganized memory in the cupboard. What EMDR does is that it arranges, it takes each one of them out because you're actually making them recall that trauma. And sometimes, literally in your presence, you can see the person reenacting that trauma. You can see them getting anxious, getting aroused, looking over their shoulders. You can see them, but there are ways to actually calm them down. And so what you're doing is that you are bringing those memories back and you are filing them away in the folders that they should be, such that over time everything is now neatly arranged. So EMDR, and that now there are some somatization therapies in terms of what is done in the body. There's now even people are talking about using dance. People are talking about using meditations. All sorts of things that people are doing. Medication is also a very important one. Um, Medication, if it's severe enough, usually talking therapy should be the first line of action, but medication can also be, and it's usually the SSRI types of antidepressants. So post-traumatic growth, it's true that trauma, it's bad. Trauma is not tidy at all. But the good thing is also that there's post-traumatic growth, and science research actually shows that up to 70% of survivors, particularly of major incidences, say that they have at least changed in a positive way at least one aspect of their lives. So post-traumatic growth is actually common. It's about the brain and the body and the mind adapting to the new, but making the best out of that new. It's really that. And you see, everyone that is looking at me today, you've experienced one sort of post-traumatic growth or the other because we all went through COVID and we're here. The reality is that COVID has taught us a lot of things. And in your individual life, in your own personal life, I'm sure that there's something that you can say. Let's face it, the reason why we are here today, this Zoom call, the last maybe over 50 Zoom calls that we've done, it's because of COVID. I mean, it was during COVID that this idea came actually, that really because there was so much trauma around, that we thought, okay, there's something we might be able to do. There's something that we can do to actually support our community. And that's where tripart care was actually born out of COVID-19 lockdown. So post-traumatic growth does happen. Um, and really, there are lots of things, lots of benefits. People feel a spiritual awakening. Sometimes people feel that they are less materialistic because they've gone through trauma and they now know what's important. Some of people are able to connect with their own values more. They're able to live a more purposeful life. They're able to identify their missions. They're able to feel a sense of gratitude. They no longer take anything for granted. They're able to feel a better appreciation of life. They are more aware of their strengths and they are more accepting of some of the things that they can't change. So, how do you support people who have had trauma? The first thing, please believe, one of the things that people who have had trauma, particularly sexual trauma, dread the most is not being believed. That's the reason why a lot of women or even men who have had that type of experiences don't say anything, because for instance, men who go through domestic violence also don't commonly talk about it because it's shameful. So the first gift we can offer them is belief, that I actually believe you. Don't minimize what they are saying. Don't talk about your own trauma or talk about, oh, yeah, that's, oh, I know, oh, my colleague also had that type of experience. No, your colleague didn't have that type of experience because your colleague would not have had verbatim the type of experience. And this person is not your colleague. Staying calm, because whether we like it or not, there are things that are called mirror neurons in our brain. Mirror neurons are nerve cells in our brain that not only fire when we act, they also fire when we see other people act. So it's like they actually they fire when we see other people act. Um, and so if we stay calm, they will be calm. If we are aroused, they will also be aroused. So it's important to be a calming, soothing presence. Give them time to talk. Really, that opportunity of silence and being able to talk is very important. Don't force someone to talk or disclose details if they don't want to. Just be there, um, and listen closely with openness. Don't offer solutions because that's not what they need. So what are the self-regulation techniques? I'm aware of at time, but basically, if there's one thing that people could learn is breathing exercises. Breathing exercises in terms of really, and that's something that for people who have experienced trauma, that's one skill that they could learn in terms of regulating their own emotions until they can get professional help. Breathing exercises, usually, just to cut the long story short, for breathing exercises, there is what I call the 5-7-8, or commonly it's known as, or some people call it box breathing. It's basically slowing down one's breathing to the point in which one is mindful of taking in breaths, um, taking in breath, the inhalation is for 5 seconds. One holds that breath for 7 seconds, and then one breathes out through the mouth for 8 seconds. So it's 5-7-8. 5 seconds to breathe in, 7 seconds to hold it, and 8 seconds to let it go. And there are all sorts of modulations of that or adaptations of that. And the other things, dancing, running, walking, all of those things can help one to actually deal with when one is still waiting for professional help. There's also engaging with nature. That's been known over and over again to also be of benefit, really being out in the wilds, walking on the sea, walking barefooted, all of those things. Gratitude journaling, worship music, scriptural meditation, positive affirmations, all of those things can actually help to bring down that hyperarousal state. That's also the same. Family time, spending time with family. And I usually say that everyone should have a happy place where your favorite place. People tell me, oh, it's my living room. Yes, we know it's your living room, but find somewhere else as well, not just your living room or your bedroom. So I think more or less, I've talked about this really in terms of supporting people, and express your support. Let them know I'm here on the long. I'm here with you on the long haul. I'm here. We're in this together. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to support you. And now those are the resources. The Royal College of Psychiatrists has very good resources on trauma. The UK Psychological Trauma Society has quite a lot of good content as well. The Body Keeps the Score. That's Dr. Basil van der Kolk. That's the book that we are doing at the Journal Club at the moment, at the book club. And our book club meets about this time, 7 to 8 p.m. not every Thursday, that would be too much. It's third Thursdays of the month online. Our book club meets. If anyone is interested in joining that, you can either send myself or Buyukumi, who is co-hosting today, or Covenant. You can send either of them a personal message, and they will make sure that you get added to the WhatsApp group where the book club operates. And we've talked about another book by Dr. Mary Bouquet, a Breaking the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma. And then there's the Kobe Campbell book. The Kobe Campbell book is Why Am I Like This? How to Break Free, How to Break Cycles, Heal from Trauma, and Restore Your Faith. And that's the Tripod Care YouTube channel. I know Buyukumi has also put the link on the chat somewhere very earlier on. If you go onto YouTube and you type in Tripod Care to bring us up, every video that we record is uploaded on there. So when this video is edited now, it's going to be recorded. It's going to be uploaded onto the YouTube channel, so you can have free access to it. Hope Made Strong and Soul Shepherding. They are really for Soul Shepherding is a group of, they're a couple, psychotherapists. Both of them are psychotherapists. I think they are in California, if I remember right. And both of them have a mission. They really support Christian leaders in things to do with mental health. They run seminars, they run retreats, and all that sort of thing. But importantly, they also have this letter that they send out, which is usually very rich in terms of mental health. Is what subscribing to. I'm subscribed to them. 16 personalities. Those are my regulars. It's good to know yourself. So I think that's a repetition of that. And those are our contact details, Tripod Care, the YouTube channel, Facebook, that's my Facebook channel. It's not something I use very often now. I think I've moved on to LinkedIn. But please connect with me on LinkedIn. And we also have an Instagram page. Tripart Care Emotional Wellbeing Hub has an Instagram page that is ably managed by Covenant, who is doing a great job as our social media manager. Is doing marvelous job. Um, right, and thank you to everyone who's been contacting us. um, we get quite a number of people who, after these seminars or workshops, come and they send messages, WhatsApp messages, emails. Please keep them coming. It's important for us to know that the work is being impactful. So don't think it's a bother. We might not reply on the very day, or we might not reply for a week, but yeah, do keep them coming. And also, we get a lot of requests for speaking engagements. The reality is that it's now at a point where I'm not able to fulfill all those speaking engagements myself. But thankfully, we have an able team of very competent, eminent, really professional speakers who will equally deliver. And I wouldn't recommend them if I don't think they would do the job. If I don't think they would do the job well, and they do the job. Sometimes I'm able to attend and really I'm really inspired about what the team members are doing. So that's what we are planning for the coming months. You can just take a photo of that, and all of those are on the way. Between now and December, God being our help, we are going to have another church and charity leaders mental training series. Another one is due. Usually it's in September, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to fit it into September. But we will do another one before the end of the year by God's grace. The Tripart Care Mind Gym 4-week course as well is something that we still have on the cards. And those are all the things that Tripart Care does. We speak not only in churches and charities, we speak corporately as well. So we speak in corporate organizations, keynote speaking, bespoke faith mental well-being training. And the WhatsApp groups, those are the WhatsApp group. That's a generic WhatsApp group. Anyone can join that WhatsApp group. It's a safe, sensitive space. We discuss mental health. We share resources particularly. And that's a place for people to connect and for people to feel safe enough. Sometimes people just come and they're just in the background. Over time, they might then decide that they want to ask for help, and then we can sort of support in getting that help. So if you just take a photo of that, the QR code, that will lead you onto the group, and then we can accept you. This other group is for leaders. So if you are a leader of a business, a charity, a Christian organization, a church, or you're in leadership of any sort, that's the one for you, because really it's a different conversation for leaders. Leaders are not only responsible for their own mental, they're also responsible for the mental health of other people. And that's the book club. So if you wanted to join the book club, Dr. Aola runs the book club, but she's not here today. She sent her apologies, but she's the one that takes the lead on the book club. And the body keeps the score is what we are discussing. And that's our Instagram page. So please subscribe to our Instagram page, and please subscribe to our Tripart Care YouTube channel as well. Let's spread the word. And right, that's Q&A. It's been a quick whistle stop tour, but trauma is a very heavy theme. And I'm now going to stop sharing, and I will start, we can go on to take questions.